Important topic. Let me make sure you can hear me first. Can you hear me? Anybody got any problem? If you do, just let me know. But we're going to talk about people and the dynamics of people and what happens when people get together and what happens when people lead. As Bill mentioned to you, I've started in this field in 1958. At that time, there was not such a field as organizational development. I was a clinical psychologist then, helping people with their emotional problems. And by chance, I happened to locate my office in a business area. So most of my patients were business people, and they started asking me to do work for their companies. And I started doing work for their companies and helping them select people and helping them develop people and helping them to retain people. And what we found out is that we could add some value to the company by helping them do a better job in those areas. When you hire someone, as you know, and you make a mistake, it's very costly. So you want to do everything possible that you can to make sure you hire people who fit the job and fit the competencies of the job, and then you've got the problem of how do you motivate and retain these people, and then you've got the problem is once they leave, how do you replace them? Those are things that over the years I've had the privilege of working with many companies. I got out of the clinical business in 1965 and totally worked with organizations. And our specialty has been primarily in the area of leadership. And that's what we're going to talk about today, is leadership. So let's move to the model. We're going to introduce you. Jeff, do I move this or do you move it?
I have the slides here. If you want, just let me.
Yeah. Well, you want me to do that or are you going to do that?
Sure. You know the slides.
Okay.
Look at them. There you go. That's going to go forward.
Oh, this is forward?
No, the arrow button that way.
Okay.
It's forward, and then that one's back.
Okay.
And
This is forward? Okay.
You're already on your first. I put you on your first one. Go back one.
Go back one?
Yeah. That's the first slide.
Okay. Well, we're going to come back to that one. So those are the areas I said that we work mostly in selection of people, the development of people, the retention of people. And let's look at this model. This is a very simple model, but it's a great model in helping you to sort out the behavior you see in individuals. For example, if you look at the vertical dimension, that dimension starts with initiative or dominance. And as you go down to the bottom of that scale, it's avoids, or that's a submissive active behavior. If you look at the horizontal dimension, if you look over at your left, you have low regard for people. Some people would call that hostility. And if you go all the way over to the right, you have high regard for people. How many of you have already thought of a person on the model? Anybody yet? What do you think is the most popular style of leadership on that model? Q1, which would be combining dominance and hostility or lack of regard. Q2, which would be blending submissiveness in with passivity. Q3, which would be combining passivity with warmth. And Q4, which would be combining dominance and warmth. Which do you think is the most popular style, or the most effective style?
Of a leader, Bob?
Yeah, of a leader.
Q4.
How many say Q4? Okay, that's good. That's been proven by research. There's literally been hundreds of researches you say that the most important characteristics of leaders is to be assertive, to be forceful, to take action, and to also have a high regard for people, where they are aware, sensitive, and responsive to the needs, the feelings, and the ideas of people. How many of you in this room think you are Q4? Raise your hand. Can you raise your hand? 1, 2, 3. Well, we have about 5 people here. Oh my. Okay, well, let me give you some statistics. About 10% of people are Q4. Okay, so you're part of a rare group, possibly. About 65% are, what do you think is the next most popular style of leadership? 65%. Out of those quadrants, what do you think would be the most popular? Q1. 65%. It used to be 25, 30 years ago, 75% were Q1. Today there's a little bit less Q1. Okay. And then you have Q2. We have about 10% there and about 15% in Q3. Let's look at these styles and begin to put a little bit of meat around it, because I think what you'll see is, again, how it becomes useful in helping you to classify behavior. It gives you a way, you all being in the field of pharmacy, this gives you a method for diagnosing a person. And when you think about this, I want you to think of previous bosses you've had, previous peers, previous direct reports. I'd like you to think of mentors you've had and where they might have fallen on the model. But let's just add some meat to this and look at what does initiate mean and what does avoid means. And initiate means taking charge, making things happen, putting the emphasis on getting results. Where avoidance means you let others lead, you tend to be passive, you tend to sit back, you tend to let the world just kind of flow by. Okay? So we've kind of put that. Now let's look at the other slide, the horizontal line, and see what that means. Put some meat on that. If we look at on the left, that essentially means there's a lack of regard for people. There's an insensitivity to people. There's an unresponsiveness to people. And if you look at the right, it means a regard for people, but it also means warmth.
Do we have the right slide up there?
Oops, that didn't flip. There it goes. Yeah, okay. Sorry about that. So we now then say, okay, if you put these together and blend them together, what are you going to get? And you come up, you say, sure, I got the right one, with Q1. And here we said 65% of people generally, oops, you got it? Oh, good. No, something happened. I think something happened when that moved. There we go. Okay, yeah, that's great. Okay. So let's look at Q1, because that's one of the most popular leadership styles in this country. If you, by the way, there are cultural differences. You can go to some countries that are considerably less Q1 than there are in here. There are others that are considerably more. I had a son who worked in Japan for 10 years. And, the Japanese have, publicity-wise, have made a big thing out of their team management. But my son tells me it's one of the most Q1 cultures that he's ever imagined. It was not at all team-oriented. Here, there's a change, a big shift occurring because younger people can't tolerate Q1. It's almost become an inappropriate concept of leadership for younger people. And if you look at the qualities of Q1, they tend to be very aggressive. They tend to be very demanding. They tend to force ideas. They interrupt discussions. I had one Q1 that I heard his boss talking to him once, and he said, "George, you are 10 minutes ahead in talking, and you're about 2 hours behind in listening." Q1s tend to be very poor listeners. They tend to be micromanagers. They tend to over-control. Q1s tend to create a culture where they perpetuate their own lack of awareness. It's very common because people are so fearful of engaging or talking to a Q1. They many times clam up. They withdraw from a Q1. They keep their communications to themselves. And this is why in Q1 situations, in Q1 cultures, big surprises sometimes occur. In other words, business was far worse than they ever dreamt. And that's because the style of the individual, of the boss, of the leader, tends to create a situation where people are reluctant to give them feedback, are reluctant to provide them with information. Because typically this kind of leader resorts or uses fear as a tactic. They feel the best way to motivate people is to create an atmosphere of fear. Now, I'll give you a good example. This goes back about 20 years ago. I was working for a large railroad, and their headquarters was located in Washington, D.C. And at that time, we were doing a great deal of leadership training for that railroad, and we were helping them select their new executives. And the president one day, the president and CEO, came by the HR department, and I was sitting there having a discussion with the vice president of human resources. And the president looks at me, he says, you give all those tests to people, how come you never given them to me? And the HR guy said, well, sir, I didn't know you wanted them. Yeah, I want you to take them, and when you got them scored up, you have Lefton come up here with you and tell me what those tests say. So that afternoon, we sent up the test to him, and he finished them, and we scored them overnight. And I thought the HR person was going to faint. When we saw the test results, he says, Bob, we're going to have to tell them these things. I said, yes, we are, but you're going to be the one that's going to tell them. I'll be there with you, but you got to tell them. So we marched up to his office the next day, and we said, we have the test scored, and we're ready to give you the feedback. He says, all right, tell me what those things say. So the HR guy says, these tests show that you are very dominant. You're very results-oriented. You're stubborn. You're hard-headed. You over-control people. You micromanage. You overwhelm people. You create fear. You're dogmatic. You're opinionated. The president looks at him, he says, well, that's very interesting. He said, did it say anything bad? Now, what does that show you? And by the way, he wasn't kidding. He thought those were great. What that shows is the lack of awareness that his behavior was having on others. Now, there are different kinds of Q1s. You could have a Q1 who's very bombastic, who screams, who hollers, who yells, pounds the desk, openly threatens you. And then you could have what I call an intellectual Q1. Intellectual Q1 is generally very polite, dignified, but they overwhelm you with their intellect and their logic. They don't listen at a thinking level to what another person is saying. They constantly interrupt, and they're constantly trying to prove how you're wrong, and they rarely really probe your view. Okay? So, there we got Q1. We have about 65% of people falling in that area. Let's take a look at Q2. As I said, about 10% of people fall in the area of Q2. A Q2 leader is a leader who's been handed the managerial sword, only to spend most of his time trying to put it back in the scabbard. The Q2 leader is a person who avoids. He's there, but you rarely see him. He's neutral. He always, when you ask him an opinion, he rarely gives you an opinion. He just expresses himself in neutral, vague terms. His basic assumption is the less you say, the longer you stay. So he's pulled back. You rarely see him. He rarely raises his hand. He rarely expresses a view candidly. He withholds information. He tends to be aloof, cautious, withdrawn, and very, very guarded. How many of you have ever worked with a Q2 here? Have you had experience working with Q2s? Never had a direct report that was Q2? We got one? Yeah.
We just fired one of those guys, yeah.
Yeah, how many of you ever worked with people who are Q1?
Yeah, I had a boss who was absolutely a Q1. He never had ulcers, but he was a carrier.
Well, yeah. Let's move over to Q3 a little bit here and talk about Q3. About 15% in Q3. The basic philosophical assumption that a Q3 has is that love conquers all. If you just try to please people and you love them to death and you give away the store, that these people will work their hearts out for you. And if I had to list the adjectives that best depicted the culture that a Q3 creates, if he's a leader, the culture that is created is one that's harmonious, very easy going. It's nicey-nicey. It's never saying anything that might offend anyone. It's instant compromise when there's a problem or a conflict. So you have this harmonious, easygoing, playful kind of atmosphere, which also, another characteristic of this culture, is bankruptcy. Very few Q3 cultures survive more than several years because it doesn't push for results. It just pushes to please people. What they try to strive for are popular decisions rather than sound decisions. Now think of that. Think of decisions that are popular and think of decisions that are sound. Many sound decisions can be very difficult to present to people, but they're sound. When it's a popular decision, you're always going to please people. So look at what happens so far in these quadrants. Q1s tend to make decisions on their own without involving people. That's what a Q1 does. A Q2, when it comes to decision making, just procrastinates, keeps putting it off, doesn't want to take a stand. Q3 is always saying, let's vote. Let's make the popular decision.
Put up the Q3 slide.
Oh, excuse me. So what Q3 does, they're overly agreeable, they're meandering, they're appeasing people, compromised too quickly. Have any of you had the opportunity of working in a Q3 culture?
I'm married to one.
Yeah. It's a lot of fun. The only problem is the survival rate is not very high. Okay? Let's look at Q4. And Q4, what you're doing is you're now blending forcefulness, you're blending initiative with the regard for people. And what you get there is a tremendous emphasis on being open, on achieving results. It's being inquiring, it's being forceful, and it's being very sensitive and responsive to the needs and feelings of others. So on the one hand, you're very forceful, but on the other hand, you care for people. You have regard for people. When it comes to decisions, you tend to reach out and solicit others' opinions. When it comes to handling disagreement or conflict, you tend to confront it. Q1 will handle conflict by forcing it. Or he'll arouse fear. Or he'll say, I know how to resolve the conflict, and you do it my way or else. Q2 avoids conflict. Q3 smooths conflict over. Q4 will face into conflict, talk it through. There's another word on there which is one of the most important of all. I want you to keep your eye on it, because as we move forward, it's one of the most powerful techniques that we have, or one of the most powerful skill set that we have that can help you become a more Q4 leader. And that's the word inquiring. Think of the concept of asking questions. See, and that, when you watch people who are Q4, they're great at asking questions. And why is asking questions so important? It's because Q4s feel they don't generally have all the answers, or they don't have the ability to make the very best decisions or the sound decisions possible. And the tool for gathering that kind of data is what we call the probe, the question. And we also call that inquiry, because we're going to talk about that soon as being a very, very powerful skill.
What was the percent of Q4 again?
About 10, a little over 10% tend towards Q4.
10%.
Yeah, very small. Yes, sir.
So, I don't know if you can generalize, but if you look at the most successful companies, especially those big companies that have a lot of younger people like Apple, like Steve Jobs,
Yes.
New